Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Mosquito Fleet by Bern Keating. Chapter 4, Battering Down the Gate, the Eastern Hinge.
The western end of the Japanese gate was nailed to the great landmass of New Guinea, and its unhinging was a natural job for the army. The eastern hinge was at Rabaul, in the tangle of islands and reef-strewn sea channels that make up the Solomon and Bismarck archipelagos. Reduction of Rabaul was naturally a navy job, to be carried on simultaneously with the army effort in New Guinea. After the fall of Guadalcanal in February 1943, the master plan in the South Pacific, under Admiral William Halsey, was to hop from island to island through the Central Solomons, reducing one by one the Japanese bases arranged like stepping stones between Guadalcanal and Rabaul. PTs were moved up as fast as new bases were established, because they were short of range and useless if they fell too far behind the front. The night the army went ashore at Rendova, June 30th, 1943, 3 PTs sailed up Blanche Channel on the approaches to the Rendova landing beach. Coming down the same channel was the American landing flotilla, transports, supply ships, and escorting destroyers. The destroyer Macaulay, damaged by one of the few Japanese air attacks that opposed the Rendova landings, was being towed to Tulagi, but was riding lower and lower in the water, and its survival was doubtful. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, riding Macaulay as flagship of the Rendova invasion force, was debating whether or not to give the stricken ship euthanasia by friendly torpedo when his mind was made up for him by 2 mysterious fish which came out of the night and blew Macaulay out of the water. The deadly PTs had struck again, but, alas, under the illusion that they were hitting an enemy transport. Explanation of the snafu? The usual lack of communications between PTs and other commands. The PTs had been told there would be no friendlies in Blanche Channel that night, and the only friendlies they encountered just happened to be the entire Rendova landing fleet. American soldiers quickly captured Rendova Island, and the PT Navy set up a base there. Across Blanche Channel, on New Georgia Island, Marines and soldiers were fighting a heartbreaking jungle action to capture the Japanese airfield at Munda, but they had taken over enough of New Georgia for another PT base on the slot side of the island. Business was slow at first for the PTs. The big ship admirals, who were fighting repeated destroyer-cruiser night actions in those waters, and who were possibly nervous about the PTs since the Macaulay incident, ordered the PTs to stay in when the big ships went out. Concern of the admirals over poor communications between PTs and other units was justified. Early on the morning of July 20th, 3 torpedo boats were returning to Rendova Base through Ferguson Passage. 3 B-25s, the same kind of aircraft that had performed such terrible execution of the Japanese in the Bismarck Sea, spotted the patrol craft and came down to the deck for a strafing run. Aboard PT-168, Lieutenant Edward Macaulay III held his gunners in tight check while they suffered under the murderous fire of the friendly planes. Repeatedly, the gunners of the 168 held their breath as the B-25s raked them with bullets, but they held their own fire in a superb display of discipline. Not so the other 2 boats. Gunners were unable to stand being shot at without shooting back, and the first PT burst of counterfire brought down a bomber in flames. Somehow, the other bombers came to their senses, and the strafing runs stopped. But all the boats had already been riddled, and 2 were burning. The 166 was past saving. Sound crew members helped the wounded over the side into life rafts and paddled frantically away from the burning craft. They made it out of danger just as the gas tanks went up in a blast of searing orange flame. Lieutenant Macaulay and his brave crew, the only group to come out of the ghastly affair with unblemished credit, took their still-burning 168 alongside the stricken bomber to rescue survivors before the plane went down. 3 of the bomber crew were dead. The 3 survivors were wounded. 1 bomber and 1 PT were lost in the sad affair. 1 officer and 10 men of the torpedo boat patrol were wounded. Reason for the tragic mistake? Same as for the Macaulay sinking. The bomber pilots had been told that there would be no friendly vessels in those waters at that time. PTs were harassed, during the night patrols by Japanese seaplanes escorting the Japanese barge convoys, so one PT skipper and a night fighter plane rigged an ambush. An American night fighter was to perch aloft. The PT was to charge about, throwing up a glittering rooster's tail of a wake to attract a float plane, and the night fighter was to jump on the float plane's back. The plan worked like a $50 clock. The noisy, rambunctious PT lured down a float plane, okay so far, and the PT's skipper conned the escorting night fighter in to the counterattack. The first word from the night fighter, however, was a disconcerting, "I'm being attacked by the float plane." "Bring him down to 2 feet, said the PT skipper, and we'll get on his tail. Nobody was hurt. PTs fought some lively barge actions on July 23rd and 27th, but the big battle, the naval battle which has earned what is surely the most exaggerated fame of all time for its importance, the Battle of the 109, took place the night between August 1st and 2nd. On the afternoon of August 1st, search planes saw 4 Japanese destroyers coming down the slot. They were loaded with 900 soldiers and supplies for the embattled defenders of the Munda airfield. It was a typical run of the Tokyo Express and a prime target for PTs. During the afternoon, when the Japanese destroyers were still far from Rendova, the Japanese showed their deep respect for motor torpedo boats by socking the Rendova base with bombs from 25 planes. 2 PTs were sunk by a bomber which crashed into their nest. One of the PTs destroyed was 164, which had survived the tragic strafing by B-25s just 11 days before. At sunset, 15 PTs, 4 of them equipped with the newfangled gadget called radar, sortied from the base under the command of Lieutenant Henry Brantingham aboard 159. Brantingham was another veteran of the MacArthur rescue run in the Philippines. The PTs were deployed around the approaches to the Japanese landing beach for resupplying Munda airfield. Lieutenant Brantingham, naturally, had chosen a radar-equipped boat for his flagship, and so was the first to pick up the Tokyo Express, just after midnight on August 2nd. Brantingham, for some reason, thought his radar pips were from landing craft and closed for a strafing run, but 4.7-inch shells from the destroyers persuaded him that his targets were fair torpedo game. He and Lieutenant Junior Grade William F. Liebnow, Jr., in 157, fired 6 torpedoes. No hits. The 2 boats escaped behind puffs of smoke. Worse than the 6 misses was the lack of communication. The other PTs, most of them without radar, didn't even know the destroyers had arrived on the scene, much less that they had been alerted by the torpedo runs of 157 and 159. Next to pick up the cans was the radar-equipped 171, carrying the division commander, Lieutenant Arthur H. Bernson. The boat's skipper, Ensign William Cullen Battle, closed at a slinking 10 knots to 1,500 yards, where Lieutenant Bernson fired a full salvo of fish. All 4 tubes blazed up in a grease fire that was as helpful to the destroyer gunners as a spotlighted bullseye. Shell bursts splashed water aboard the 171 as the boat ripped out to sea. Again, the attacking PT, which had missed its target, failed to report by radio to the other PT skippers, who were straining their eyes in the darkness looking for ships they didn't know were already on the scene. A third radar boat, Lieutenant George E. Cookman's 107, picked up the cans on the radar set and missed with 4 fish. 3 other PTs, aroused by the flash of destroyer gunfire, came running from the southeast. A Japanese float plane strafed them, and destroyer salvos straddled the boats. But they got off all their torpedoes, 12 of them, and all 12 missed. The Tokyo Express went through the strait and unloaded 900 soldiers and supplies. So bad were communications between the PTs that most of the 15 skippers who had started the patrol still didn't know that the destroyers had arrived and been unsuccessfully attacked, much less that they had already discharged their cargoes and were going home. And that meant the destroyers were coming up on the PT lookouts from behind. At the wheel of the 109 was Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. The boat was idling along on one engine to save fuel and to cruise as silently as possible. Good PT doctrine for night patrol. A lookout on the destroyer Amagiri saw the 109 at about the same instant a lookout on the PT saw the destroyer. Making a split-second decision, Japanese Commander Hanami ordered the helmsman to spin the wheel to starboard and ram. The Yamagiri crashed into the starboard side of the 109 and killed the lookout on the spot. The boat was cut in two. The rear section sank. Burning gasoline covered the sea. The Yamagiri sailed on, but at a reduced speed because the 109, in its death agony, had bent vanes on the Yamagiri's starboard propeller, causing violent vibration at high speeds. PT-169 fired torpedoes at the Yamagiri, but at too close a range for them to arm and explode. PT-157 fired two that missed. 30 torpedoes were fired that night, and the only damage inflicted on the destroyers was by the quite involuntary and fatal body block of the 109. It was not the greatest night of the war for the PT Navy. 11 survivors of the 109 searched surrounding waters for two missing shipmates, but never found them. They spent the night and the next morning on the still floating bow section. By mid-afternoon, they decided that no rescue was on the way. Since they felt naked and exposed to Japanese plane and ship patrols, they set out to swim 3.5 miles to a desert island, the skipper towing a badly burned shipmate for 4 hours by a life jacket tie-tie gripped between his teeth. After harrowing nights spent on several desert islands, nights during which the skipper showed most extraordinary stamina, resourcefulness, and courage, the shipwrecked sailors were found by native scouts. They took the heroic skipper by canoe to a coast watcher station, and there he boarded a rescue PT and returned for his marooned companions. The skipper of the 109 was, of course, the same John F. Kennedy, who on January 20th, 1961, became the 35th President of the United States. After Munda fell, and with it all of New Georgia, American strategists studied the map and decided that island-by-island reduction of Japanese strength was too tedious. They decided to start bypassing some of the bases, cutting off the bypassed garrisons, and starving them behind an American sea blockade. More night work for the PTs. Up the line a bit was the island of Vella La Vella, only lightly held by the Japanese. American strategists chose a beach called Baracoma as a possible landing spot and ordered a reconnaissance. 4 PTs, on the night between August 12th and 13th, carried a scouting party of 45 men to the beach at Baracoma. A Japanese plane nagged the boats with strafing and bombing runs for 2 hours. A near miss tore up the planking on the 168 and wounded 4 sailors, so the 168 had to drop out of the operation. But the other 3 boats put their passengers ashore safely. Scouts reported that the only Japanese around that part of the island were shipwrecked survivors of an earlier sea battle. So 36 hours later, 4 more PTs landed reinforcements. Japanese snooper planes spotted the PT passenger runs, but apparently the Japanese high command couldn't think of torpedo boats as invasion craft, so the scout landings were made without interference. The main force followed, and by October 1st, all of Vella La Vella was in American hands. The Japanese began shrinking their Solomon Islands perimeter, falling back to the islands on the near side of the new American base at Vella La Vella. American destroyers, out to smash the evacuation barge line, met a Japanese destroyer screen for the Daihatsus on the night between October 6th and 7th. As usual, Japanese torpedoes were deadly. 1 American destroyer went down and 2 others were sorely damaged. More important, the Japanese supply and evacuation train ran its errands without molestation from the American cans. The American destroyers did sink the Japanese Yugumo, and American PTs were sent to pick up 78 survivors. Aboard the 163, an American sailor offered a cup of coffee to one of the captive Japanese, who killed the Good Samaritan, and of course, died himself at the hands of the murdered sailor's shipmates. PT sailors felt less uneasy about the massacre of the shipwrecked Japanese at the Bismarck Sea after the treacherous murder of their comrade by a rescued Japanese. Having successfully leapfrogged once, American strategists looked at the map again. The whole point to the island-hopping campaign was to put American fighter planes close enough to Rabaul so that they could screen bombers over that base and keep the Japanese pinned down there under constant bombardment. The best site for a fighter base was Bougainville Island, so American planners put their fingers on the map and said, "This is the place for the next one." Accordingly, Marines landed at Cape Torokaina on Bougainville on November 1st. Their mission was to capture enough of the island to build and protect a fighter strip. The rest of the island could be left to the 15,000 Japanese soldiers who defended it. Nobody cared about them. Rabaul was the real target. The Japanese High Command at Rabaul sent down a cruiser-destroyer force with the mission of getting among the American transports in Empress Augusta Bay off Torokina and tearing up the helpless train ships like a pack of wolves in a herd of sheep. An American cruiser-destroyer force met them just after midnight on November 2nd and sank one Japanese cruiser and a destroyer. More important, the American flotilla ran off the Japanese marauders before they reached the transports. American reconnaissance planes, however, spotted a massive concentration of heavy cruisers and destroyers building up in Rabaul Harbor, a concentration too great for American naval forces then in the South Pacific to handle, because most American capital ships of the Pacific Fleet had been pulled back toward Hawaii to support an operation in the Gilbert Islands. Admiral Halsey scratched together a carrier task force, and even though a carrier raid near a land-based airfield was then against doctrine, he sent the carrier's planes into the harbor. They damaged the cruisers badly enough to relieve the immediate threat to the Torokina landings. The carrier raids stirred up a hornet's nest around Rabaul. 18 Japanese torpedo bombers took off to smash the brazen carrier task force. Just before total dark, they found American ships and attacked. Radio Tokyo broadcast with jubilation that the score in this first air battle of Bougainville was one large carrier blown up and sunk, one medium carrier set ablaze and later sunk, and two heavy cruisers and one cruiser and destroyer sunk. Rabaul's torpedo bombers won a group commendation. An American staff officer, hearing the account of this first air battle of Bougainville, as reported by Japanese pilots, could only hold his head in his hands and hope his own pilots were not feeding him the same kind of foolishness. Here is what really happened in the first air battle of Bougainville. A landing craft, the LCI-70 and the PT-167, were lumbering back from a landing party on the Torokina beachhead. Just after sunset, the Japanese bombers struck in low-level torpedo runs. The PT brought down the leader by the novel method of snagging him with its mast. The plane's torpedo punched clean through the PT's nose, leaving its tail assembly, appropriately enough, in the crew's head. The torpedo boat's 20mm cannon shot down a second torpedo bomber so close to the ship that the sailors on the fantail were soaked. 4 torpedo bombers launched their fish at the LCI, but since the torpedoes were set for attack on a deep-draft carrier, they passed harmlessly under the landing craft's shallow hull, except for one which porpoised and jumped through the LCI's thin skin, unfortunately killing one sailor. The unexploded warhead came to rest on a starchy bed in the bread locker. The torpedo was still smoking, so the LCI's skipper, Lieutenant Junior Grade H.W. Frey, ordered, "Abandon ship." Time passed, no explosion. A damage control party reboarded the LCI and rigged her for a tow back to Torokina. PT-167 raced ahead with the wounded. Rear Admiral T.S. Wilkinson radioed congratulations to Ensign Theodore Berlin, skipper of the PT, for knocking down a plane with his mast. "Fireplug sprinkles dog," is the way the Admiral put it. So ended the first air battle of Bougainville. PTs quickly set up a base on Puruwata Island, just off the Torokina beachhead, even though the marine foothold was still feeble. Sea patrols of the torpedo boats were still vexed by poor communications. The night of November 8th, for instance, the destroyers Hudson and Anthony came up to Torokina, sure that there were no friendly PTs in the bay, because higher-ups on the beach had told them so. Naturally, when radar picked up the pips of patrolling PTs 163, 169, and 170, they let fly with everything. The PTs, equally misinformed about what friendlies to expect, took the destroyer broadsides to be a most unfriendly action and maneuvered for a torpedo run. The skipper of the 170 tried to decoy the 2 American destroyers into a trap. He called the 163 by radio to warn him that he was leading 3 nip cans into their torpedo range. PT-163 got off a long shot at the 3 cans, which fortunately missed. There has been much fruitless speculation about that third mysterious can, reported by 170. Aboard the 170, the radar screen showed a big target, not one of the 2 American destroyers, 10,000 yards dead ahead. A salvo of shells that looked like ash cans passed overhead, coming from the same direction as the radar target. To this day, nobody knows who was the assailant, with guns big enough to fire ashcan-sized projectiles. The running duel lit up the bay for 45 minutes. The torpedo boats were just coming around for a new torpedo run when Anthony figured out what was going on. "Humblest apologies," the Anthony said by radio in a handsome bid to accept all the blame. "We are friendly vessels." Farther west near Arrai on New Britain on Christmas Day 1943, Lieutenant Ed Farley's 190, with Lieutenant Commander HMS Swift aboard, and Ensign Rumsey Ewing's 191 were returning to the Dregar Harbor Base in New Guinea after a dull patrol. Between 30 and 38 Japanese dive bombers and fighters came down from the north and bombed and strafed the boats in groups of 3 and 4. The two little PTs were in a jam, for the force attacking them was large enough to take on a carrier task force, screen destroyers and all. The boats separated, went to top speed, and zigzagged toward a bank of low clouds 12 miles away. Japanese planes often made one pass at PTs and then dropped the job if they did not score. But this overwhelming big flight of planes returned for repeated attacks. PT skippers clamored for fighter cover from the beach. Aboard the 191, the skipper was hit in the lungs and Ensign Fred Calhoun took command. A machine gun bullet pierced his thigh, but he hung on to the wheel to play a deadly game of tag with the attackers. He held a steady course, his eye fixed to the bomb racks of the attacking plane, until the bomb was away and committed to its course. Then he whipped over the wheel to put the boat where the bomb wasn't when it landed. Nevertheless, fragments from a near miss knocked out a 20-millimeter gun and severely wounded the gunner, Chief Motor Machinist Mate Thomas Dean, and the loader, Motor Machinist Mate Second Class August Shuto. Another near miss punched an 18-inch hole in the port side and peppered the superstructure with steel splinters. Japanese strafers hit the port and starboard engines and punctured the water jackets, which spurted jets of boiling water into the engine room. Engineer of the watch Victor Bloom waded into the streams of scalding water to tape and stuff leaks so that the engines would not overheat and fuse into a solid mass. Fearing that the gas fumes from punctured lines might explode, he closed off the fuel tank compartment and pulled a release valve to smother it with carbon dioxide. When he had tidied up his engine room, Bloom gave first aid to the wounded. Not surprisingly, Victor Bloom won a Navy Cross for this action. By this time, the two PTs had knocked 4 planes into the sea near the boats. "Toward the end of the attack," said Lieutenant Farley, "the enemy became more and more inaccurate and less willing to close us. It is possible that we may have knocked down the squadron leader as the planes milled about in considerable confusion, as if lacking leadership." 40 minutes after they were called, P-47 fighter planes from Finschhafen arrived to drive off the shaken Japanese, apparently startled by the 2 floating buzzsaws. One of the P-47s was hit and made a belly landing about half a mile from the 190. The pilot, though badly wounded in the head and arm, freed himself and escaped from the cockpit before his plane went down. The 190 went to the rescue of its rescuer, and Lieutenant Commander Swift and Seaman First Class Joe Cope jumped overboard to tow the groggy pilot to the undamaged PT. Authorities were as astonished as the Japanese attackers had been by the savage and effective response of the 2 PTs to the massive attack which should have wiped them out, according to all the rules. Smaller and less determined air attacks had sunk cruisers and destroyers in other waters. Commander Mumma, with justifiable pride in his 2 boats, said of the action, "It has shown that the automatic weapon armament is most effective. It has demonstrated that ably handled PTs can, in daylight, withstand heavy air attack." On the same Christmas Day, 1943, the Bougainville bomber strip went into business, and the fighter strips were so well established that American forces could afford to settle down behind the barbed wire of the perimeter, content with what they already held. From here on out, they could afford to ignore as much as possible the 15,000 Japanese still on the island. From that day, Rabaul was doomed to comparative impotence under a merciless shower of bombs. Not that Rabaul was a feeble outpost. 100,000 Japanese soldiers, behind powerful fortifications and with immense supplies, made Rabaul a formidable fortress, too tough for a direct frontal assault until the end of the war. Without air power, however, the Japanese there could do nothing to hold back the Allied advance, except to glower at the task forces passing by just out of gun range on their way to new island bases farther up the line. The Japanese gate was unhinged at both ends, and the Allies poured through the gap. American strategists decided to jump over Rabaul, leaving its defenders to shrivel away behind a sea blockade. Some of the PTs leapfrogged with the rest of the Allied forces and readied for more night patrol in the waters farther along the sea lanes to Tokyo. Some of them stayed behind to make life as miserable as possible for the bypassed Japanese on Bougainville and the other islands cut off from home. PTs played a big part in the last jump that isolated Rabaul. The landings in the Admiralty Islands were on Leap Year Day, February 29, 1944, by units of the 1st Cavalry Division. The Admiralty Islands are a ring of long, thin islands, enclosing a magnificent anchorage called Seidler Harbor. The fine anchorage and the airstrips planned for the islands would give the Allies the last brick in the wall around Rabaul. Faulty reconnaissance from the air had shown that the islands were free of Japanese. Actually, there were 4,000 Japanese in the islands, and their commander was insulted that the Americans landed a force only a fraction the size of his. He counterattacked violently. The only Navy fire support available was from destroyers and small craft. Among the small craft were MTB Squadron 21, commanded by Lieutenant Paul Rennell, and Squadron 18, commanded by the same Lieutenant Commander HMS Swift, who had surprised the Japanese Air Command by the vicious anti-aircraft fire of his 2 torpedo boats near Arawe on Christmas Day. The PTs went to work for the cavalry as a kind of sea cavalry, running errands, carrying wounded, towing stranded boats off the beach, handling the lead line to measure a poorly charted harbor bottom, and even carrying cavalry generals on scouting missions. From inside Seidler Harbor, they gave the cavalry close fire support with machine guns and mortars. A keen-eyed sailor on 363 knocked a sniper out of a tree with a short burst, for instance, and the crew of the 323 demolished with 50 calibers a Japanese radio and observation platform in another tree. The island of Manus fell quickly, and Major General I.P. Swift, commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division, in a generous tribute to a sister service, said, "The bald statement, 'The naval forces supported this action,' is indeed a masterpiece of understatement. Without the Navy, there would not have been any action."
This concludes today's reading of The Mosquito Fleet by Bern Keating, presented by Major Antonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at antonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.